a lot of this is driven by my own experiences, what I have seen growing up, the way parenting in my home has affected me, and what I have had to undo in terms of some patterns. I mean, and also because being a parent myself, I would like to learn about, okay, what it is that do I need to pass on, which are healthy belief systems for my daughter. So in a way, it is, it's. I read this quote somewhere. It is much easier to bring up a healthy child as compared to fix. Not broken is not the right word, but if there is a lot of traumatic experiences or
Mm.
untoward experiences in childhood, it takes a lot more to have that done, have that sorted out as compared to having the right environment. So it's like a stitch in
Yeah.
time, save nine concept. And of course, these days technology is a big deal. I think it's a great distractor. And if any of you had the opportunity to look at the paper which we sent out in the auto email was on looking up, I think that article makes it extremely clear the impact that our digital devices have on our creativity, on our cognitive abilities, etc. So, I mean, these are a few driving forces beneath the project, why we're doing what we are doing. And I met Dr. Fiona Kerr in Adelaide last year. We met at a conference, the New Day conference over there. We barely spoke for about like 5 or 7, 10 minutes, maybe standing near the stage. And I was sharing with her the project that I was working on. It was still in my mind at that time. It wasn't really formed. So just, we stayed in touch. And then it occurred to me that, well, we've got into this project, let's do something for parents. And I just reached out to Dr. Kerr and I asked her that, would you be willing to do the sessions for us to start us off with? And it did not take her any time to reply back saying, yeah, sure. And, she is very accomplished. She has got tremendous, I mean, we know her in the context of parenting and neuroscience, but she's also got tremendous qualifications and capabilities in actually creating high performing organizations. So we had that conversation. We discovered that common ground when we spoke on the web, on the Zoom call the first time that she and I spoke, maybe a few months ago when I was back over here. So very, very grateful for having Dr. Kerr over here with us. She's going to be here in the month of June and July as well. And she's a world-renowned expert on how we build the new brain, which is referred to as neurogenesis, I believe, and the neuroscience of interaction. So that's between humans and also between humans and technology. And she will be addressing the very much debated topic and discussed topic with a lot of maybe myths and misgivings on technology and parenting. Dr. Kerr is the founder of the Neurotech Institute in Adelaide, Australia, and she has spoken at multiple conferences about building a human, how the brain develops, on human connection, on empathy, on learning and technological interaction, and specifically for children. So the way we would do this is that I will hand over to Dr. Kerr. She's going to do a screen share. She has a presentation, perhaps 15-20 minutes. I think that's what you mentioned. We do that,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then we will open it up for Q&A, and we should wrap up in the next 45-50 minutes at the most, I would suppose. Okay, so over to you.
Okay, so because we've got 3 weeks, we've got the luxury of sort of building up some information this time about how does the brain form, how does your relationship with your child form their, their body, their brain, their heart, how they interact. And we will talk a bit about what does that mean for the interaction with tech. And then we've got another couple of weeks, I think, so Puneet and I were talking about next week being what's the whole area around social empathy and what that means in terms of your family and how that impacts interaction of small children with the children we're talking about, probably 4 to 8, with their friends, with their family, with their peers, those kinds of things. And then the third week can be the context. And through all of them, we can weave what is technology doing in that space? How can you use it well? And what do you need to think about, look out for? So this is the first one, which we thought we'd dive in at first to how do you actually, how do you build a brain, and how do you build a well, I guess, a well-balanced child. So I will now do this screen share, and I'll get it organized again because it's gone off to the side. So let me see. Here we go. So I'll swap you around, and here we go. So what I thought I'd do was to just talk you through some of the original, I guess, some of the ideas that are in the Looking Up book, but things that I work with all the time, with, I guess, all different ages. So one of the fascinating things, we'll take a few minutes just to go right back to the beginning. I know that we're not looking at small babies, but it's how we start. So it's an interesting way to at least look at how the brain starts to form. So you can see on the screen right now, what you've got in newborns is lots of neurons, which are like little stars, but they're not connected up. And as they get connected, what we're doing with our brain is differentiating out the different parts of the brain. So it's starting to specialize in certain areas. So when a baby's first born, it's got, 100 billion neurons. It's got a lot of neurons. And what it then does right from day one is to start building the connections, and everything they touch and smell and roll around on, they're just these little sponges that soak up information. And what they do over 3 years is there is a chemical in your brain, BDNF it's shortened to, which lets that information just get mapped down immediately all the time. So every time they have any interaction, they map it into their brain. It allows them to shape their brain to figure out what's going on, to take in all of that data, that information. So they're stimulating their brain all the time, because one of the things about our brain is we're always pruning it, which means we're chopping out about a neuron a second. We're always reshaping it depending on what we're paying attention to and what we're stimulating it with. And we're building brand new brain as well sometimes. So certainly in the first 3 years, they're building brand new brain all the time. It's why they sleep so much, because their brain's really busy. And it's all that stimulation. So just to show how real this is a picture of 2 3-year-old brains. So on the left is the brain of a child who's being stimulated and held and touched and taught and sang to, and that brain, you can see it's quite dense. There's lots of grey and white matter, and then the brain on the right hand side is almost probably half the size, and that's a 3-year-old who's been profoundly neglected. So what happens then is they still keep pruning, but there's no stimulation for building new brain. So they get atrophy in white areas, grey areas, and they get real changes. And so that goes back to your comment, Puneet, on how it's a lot harder to change damage than it is to stimulate in the first place and to kind of grow a good brain. So what happens when we interact? When we first, under a second, when the children start to interact with us, with each other, we have various neurons that turn on. So the mirror neuron, and they fire whenever they bond, and they fire in a really positive situation. And we've got subsets that look at affect, that try and figure out intent. So lots of mammals, lots of animals that interact have mirror neurons. We've got something called a spindle neuron, and that is very much around the social structure of the family and the group that you live in. And already we're starting to fire things that go towards trust and empathy. And then we've got this beautiful lot of oscillation. So we're finding out more and more that when we interact directly, we get lots of chemicals that we give across each other, the space to each other. We've got something called a volatilome, which is about 1,840 chemicals so far. And we've got all sorts of things that we pick up from each other, even when we don't touch and look at each other, we're still giving information across this space. It's why we can pick up, you know, the sense of whether people are happy and sad. But when you've got small children, it's why you equilibrate cortisol and you know, oxytocin. So if you're happy, they're happy. Those sorts of things happen, and why people also balance out hormones together if you're living together. So we just pick up lots and lots of information straight away. So face-to-face activation is really amazing. When you're looking at your child, here's a little scan of a storyteller. So when we interact, especially with someone we know and someone we like, and hopefully you like your children, then we get brain-to-brain coupling. We get neural synchronization that we can measure. So we've got hyperscanning caps like fMRI caps or fNIRS caps, and we can put them on and we can watch areas light up across the two brains. It's just beautiful. And what you get, so this picture is even the storyteller, they're already firing off lots of information to the person that they're describing something to, and their brain is being very busy, and they're also giving out these actual 3 to 8 megahertz voice oscillations as well. So lots and lots of information is coming over to that brain that's receiving it. And what will happen is when we're listening to a story, our brain lights up in the same kind of way as well. So we've got lots of neural stimulation. And retinal eye lock, what that does is, what you'll notice is if your child's ever upset or worried, then they will tend to look into your eyes more. And you also do it with your partner. And what we're doing as sort of human animals that want to raise the oxytocin is we're built so that when we're stressed, we look for oxytocin to make ourselves feel more bonded. And a really fast way to do that is to get direct eye lock with a person that you trust. So that's why someone will kind of stare at you and look into your eyes. And it's why you look at them as well. It's also why you say, look at me, when you want me to pay attention and actually, you know, tell the truth or think about what they're doing, because you're setting off oxytocin, dopamine, a lot of things when you directly look at them. So I've done a study on the neurophysiological impact of touch and eye gaze on healing and trust. And there were some really interesting things around eye contact. So it has a lot of impacts on the social brain structure and the communication, as we've said, all sorts of things to do with trust and intent. There's lots of things around people feel more soothed, and that's because it starts to interact with your amygdala areas, it calms various nervous systems, and so you've got the positive chemicals, and you've also got less of the stress activity going on. And you've also got higher levels of neuroplasticity, because the kind of chemicals you start to give off are the kind of chemicals that start that lovely flow of those kind of neurogenesis chemicals that allow you to change your mind, actually, and to change your brain and to grow a new brain. You also get immune system changes. So one of the reasons that children are happy and more physically well in the situation of a loving family environment is that one of the things oxytocin does is it stimulates the immune system, and it helps that whole endocrine system to work really well. It strengthens it. So you get this happy, healthy, bouncing kind of child. Okay, a good example of the bonding was I was having a really good look at a child, a baby in feeding, and whether it's a father holding the child or the mum breastfeeding or holding the child when they're feeding from a bottle. The focal length is one thing. That the focal length of a baby, when you're looking into its eyes, when you're holding it, is perfect for a lot of stimulation in that brain, where it's one of the reasons why they gaze at you while they feed. So you've got a really good focal length for bonding. And also there's about 5 areas that turn on. There's a social area that turns on, there's various emotional pathways that turn on, there's all sorts of pleasure centers that turn on because you've got food, and that stimulates really positive things. Again, you can watch the amygdala light up, and you start to get this whole social network syncing happening as well in that interaction. So all of that's happening when you're just gazing, when you're looking at a child, when you're feeding it. So what happens then when you brext? what you do is you disconnect from a lot of that direct neural synchronization. You've still got feel, touch, so that's still a massive vector of beautiful chemicals, but there's a lot that stops. So we've got to really think about that. And it's when I talk to parents about that, they think, oh, they just haven't realized that that's what's happening. So that's why you feel so connected to the child when you're actually looking at it when you're feeding. Another interesting thing about that is if you're singing to your child, or when you sing to them at night, one of the interesting things about voice is because their brain is not well developed, they can't hear. They can just hear white noise if you put one of the lullaby apps on. But what they can hear and differentiate is their mother's voice, because they've heard it in utero and they've heard it. And so their brain's already differentiated out and can identify that that's what it is. And they also have a very positive connected feeling when they hear it. So don't worry about the expensive technical apps, and don't worry about how good your voice is or how bad. Just sing to your child. And that's at any age. We were still singing, I guess, lullabies with mine, who are now 26 and 30, would probably say, Mum, we've been talking about it, when they were teenagers. So it's a really interesting kind of way to connect. And in fact, voice is interesting because voice starts to get into the use of tech as well. So one of the things to think about is, again, it's another way that we are built to connect. So we pick up oscillations between 3 and 8 hertz of voice. We have a little part of our brain that's oscillating all the time at that frequency, and it looks for the human voice. So it's a really interesting form of coupling, and the kinds of things that it creates, the alpha, theta and gamma waves, are all endorphin giving waves. So when you're talking to your child, they're getting lots of endorphins. They're also getting gentle problem solving kind of activity going on in their brain as well, rather than frantic kind of activity. So there's lots of things going on when you talk to them. Another thing that happens is you can watch emotional states in brains during speech discussion, and they synchronize. They tend to equilibrate as well. So it's very multisensory. We think of voice just being voice, but there's lots going on. So touch, just quickly. This is really just for people, I'll zip through it, for people that want to think about, if you've got small children, that you get lots of really lovely things with touch. But with older children, you still get lots of the same chemicals. When you're just holding them, when they're leaning on you, when they're sort of spreading their arm across you if you're on the couch, those sorts of things are still really important for connection, and they are as adults as well. If you give each other a 20-second hug, you get this massive oxytocin release as a couple. So yeah, you get lots of different kinds of hugs. And even just leaning on a teacher and that kind of thing, when you're listening to a story, you'll notice that children will they'll shuffle up to you much more closely when they're doing these kind of things. And it's because they're turning on lots of those C fiber attenuations, they're called. Touch goes through the fibers in your skin and goes into the emotional parts that surround the parts of the brain that then actually look at what the touch is doing to your body. So yeah, there's loads of things happening. So you get this lovely sense of kind of belonging then when you've got all of those things going on. Another thing to think about is we were talking about the brain working well when you pay attention to various things, and how we build brain and shape brain depending on what you pay attention to. Now that's true at any age. If you're really interested in something, you will tend to have more expertise in it, and it's a cycle. You pay more attention to it, you absorb more details about it, you pay more attention to it. Well, when you're paying attention to your child, one of the things you're doing is, again, you're getting that neural synchronization going. And when you're not paying attention to them, one of the problems then is, if it's all right, you can't watch them all the time and make them the center of the attention, because that's got its own issues. But if a child's trying to get your attention, and especially once they start to get into the 6, 7, 8-year-old, and probably more even the 7 to 8-year-old bracket, they're starting to learn a lot about their own self-worth as well, and their own value in being able to interact and being worth interacting with. And it's quite disturbing when we start to look at what happens in those terms when you're constantly distracted. So what we've seen over the last 10, probably 15 years now, is when especially girls, it seems to be a trend, get to about that age, if they have the parents who are constantly getting disconnected by looking at their phones, you know, by texts coming in and checking those sorts of things, what you're actually saying to that child every time you stop and look at something else is, this is more important. So that's one thing that's happening. But the other thing that's happening is we're actually breaking that neural connection that we have when the child is deep in conversation with us. So there's a number of things that start to happen. Just like kids, if I do an experiment, or used to sometimes with adults, where I would get them to sit two at a time, and they would sit looking at each other. And for 1 minute, one person had to talk about something, and the other person had to convince them that they were really interested. So they would lean in and they would nod, and there would be lots of eye connection, and you'd listen to what they said for a minute. And they tended to talk about something they liked or that they enjoyed, and then you got them to switch, and the other person had to talk. But the first person now had to completely ignore them. They had to look totally bored. They had to fiddle with things and do something else. And it's fascinating to watch the difference, because the person that's then talking, I've seen a whole range. I've seen them try and actually grab the other adult's face and make them look at them. I've seen them get up and walk out. I've seen them just stop because they couldn't talk, knowing that someone wouldn't listen. But the thing that was most interesting was most people would keep going because it was you know, an exercise they had to do, but they stopped talking about anything that mattered to them. Because we can't talk to someone about something that matters to us when the person's signaling that it doesn't matter to them. And that's what happens when you've got this constant distraction on your phone. And it's not just for kids, it's also for your partner. You know, it's why when you're at home, you really should be at home, because we not only is it a social issue of looking at your phone, but we're actually breaking neural circuitry to get, you know, between each other as well. So the more we get good tech which can show us this, the more fascinating it is when we have a look at all of these different vectors that then break when you keep getting disconnected and looking at the technology. So yeah, you've really got to think about that. So we've always had rules around that. And one of the funny things is in the last few years, there's been all these kind of, you can now look up YouTubes and those sorts of things when you see the dog, the pet who will come and steal your phone and run away with it and bury it, because they understand as well that there's this disconnect going on. So the results of the direct connection in this age, when they're at school, when they're at home, is things like you get increased trust and empathy, and you also get lower resistance to new ideas, because what happens is you've got all those lovely chemicals going on in their brain. So they're much more apt to be able to absorb new information and not be skittish about new kind of concepts. This works in adults as well. They're also quicker. They can take in more information, and they're faster at thinking about responses and ideas. So we've got this fantastic chemical cocktail going on with all of the sort of creative interaction that's happening. There was a really interesting, let's see, yes, this one. So there was a really interesting classroom study where, and I think I've mentioned that in the Looking Up book, where they did a hyperscanning activity and capped all of the children in this age group, and they've done it with older children as well. And they watched what happened with the kids interacting, how often there was synchronization across different children, how often they were synchronizing with the teachers. And one of the things that they interestingly did was they took half of the children and got them to do 2 minutes of looking at each other while they were chatting before they came into the classroom, one of the sessions. And the other half didn't do that 2-minute eye-to-eye contact. And then they capped them up again, all of them, and they watched what they did in an exercise. And not only was there increased social closeness between not just the kids that looked at each other, but the kids that looked at each other were also better at sending synchronization signals to other children as well. But there was increased general brain-to-brain synchrony. And the other thing was those kids were much more activators. They were much less passive. They tended to have ideas more quickly. They tended to get involved. So their attention was heightened. And that's because they had a lot of that interactive attention, chemical activity stimulated in the time that they sat. So if we think about it, it's one of the good points when we have schools that don't allow mobiles or cell phones in the school. Because what happens as soon as you give kids their cell phone is, because it's a massive distractor, they'll stick on their phone until they have to go into a class and relinquish it. So you cut out a lot of that interaction outside the class, never mind in the class if they're allowed to. But most schools that I know now actually won't let them come to school, the mobile phones. So I don't know if that's the rule, they're the rules in Britain, or if it's all different across Britain. I guess we can talk about that. So quickly, the other aspects of neurogenesis, because we talked about building new brain. So we've just talked about a massive way, which is direct human interaction. So another thing is daydreaming. So kids have to have time, at least an hour a day, of doing nothing. Because doing nothing is structure them around an activity, and they're not being distracted by a screen. Then their brain goes into default mode, which is the daydreaming mode, and it becomes really busy. It starts to connect up all sorts of things it doesn't normally connect. You start to actually also reflect much more on ideas, feelings. You get in touch with who you are and what you think and what you're doing a lot more. So your brain gets very, very busy on a different kind of connecting up, and it's a really useful thing to do when the kids, and they also go into creative mode as well. So it shifts what we call into abstractive neural networks. So they get connections across little bits that they don't when you're pushing it into a task activity, because instead it lets the brain just kind of riff and play and cross connect, and that's certainly as adults, that's where you come up with really good ideas as well. So it's not nearly as linear. And they're also more productive and creative if you just give them that space. And again, one of the things with sort of technology is the speed with which they use technology and they interact with it and they hop across and they scan, it stops that. So this abstraction stops when they get that distraction of that kind of very different way of using your brain. So it's like a neural reset. It's like a shower for their brain. It's a really good thing to do, and it can calm them down as well. And even if they're walking and playing outside, doing that sort of thing, and in nature, that's a very strongly part of what's happening in their brain. On the other hand, if they are stressed, then that stops some of that activity. And so if they are feeling like they're pressured and they can't do that, or if they've got too many things to do, we keep the kids going from one thing to another. They've got different classes every night as well as during the day. Then we can start getting levels of different kinds of chemicals, cortisol, adrenaline, and we just get less of that sort of activity that allows their nervous systems to relax and their affect to kind of be quieter. Sleep's fascinating in that small kids need a good 9 hours, and in fact so do teenagers. They need even more because their brain is massively working. That's not the discussion here, but it's a fascinating different one. So what happens in the first few stages of sleep is you get much more of the maintenance, and then in the second, sort of in the last few cycles, and especially in the last one or two cycles, about hour 6. So the first cycles are cleaning off plaque and lowering blood pressure and those kind of things, cardiac rhythm. And then you go into something called pre-REM 2, which is a filing system. So all the things those children have learned, and indeed us, have learned during the day, we file. And that doesn't happen. We don't take them out and actually start putting them into long-term memory until then. So if they don't get any sleep, they don't file it. You don't learn. You don't keep what you've learned for the day. And then in the very last cycles, you actually start that abstraction, that lovely REM sleep, which again means that the brain starts to play. And that's often where you wake up and you go, oh, I know what to do. I come up with the idea or the answer to something. So sleep on it. It's absolutely right. The other thing is napping. We've taken naps out of primary schools and sometimes even kindergartens. And in most countries, we've taken it out. We don't nap during the day, but we're biphasic. So we are built to have one long sleep and then to have one nap, because we've got the homeostatic curve and the circadian rhythm that are kind of clashing for those 24 hours, but they align in that sort of, late, just after lunch, if you like, nap day. 20 minutes, again, it's like an absolute spring clean for their brain. They get all sorts of happy chemicals back in. They drop the fatigue. They're able to take in information again. They get better motor dexterity. There's lots of things, and that's as adults as well. Exercise is another thing. And some of the fascinating things about exercise is that it actually improves the executive function in the front of their brain. So it makes that more efficient and more effective. It increases, again, the neurogenesis, because you start getting that BDNF running around in their brain. If you give them exercise and glucose, because glucose, the brain uses a lot of glucose when it works. So that's why food's important. But and then another thing that this does is exercise has a particular capacity to improve synaptic survival. So it makes those synaptic connections stronger, the ones that they make, because they will tend to break if they're not used and repurpose. And so exercise is very good at that. And another thing is it lowers, it sort of blows off cortisol. So it lowers resistance to stress in a lot of ways as well. Yeah, so another thing is to do with that motor neuron system is encouraging non-linear writing. So something, again, that is different to the, I guess, the screens, although I know we have writing apps on screens, is when kids use their hands, in fact, all of us, and we draw and we write rather than typing and swiping, then we engage the motor neuron system quite differently, and different parts of our brain turn on. So we even make notes differently. And I've had adults come up after I've spent a couple of days with them, say as professors in uni, and they'll say, oh no, that's all right, I've got my iPad and I'm writing on it. And then one, I can remember specifically, one of them, their iPad wasn't working anymore and they had to use a notebook. And she came up at the end of the day and she said, I would never have believed it. I've compared the notes I took over the 2 days and they're quite different. So it's really interesting how much that changes what we take on. And drawing is a very different part of the brain than them writing. So when you get them to do a concept, drawing it, it's a hugely different process, again, in their brain than writing it. And you can be an adult too. So that's some of my drawing, which looks really terrible, but that's sometimes how I like to think about things. Microbiome, because we have, billions and billions of bacteria, they actually create 90% of the serotonin. So it's our second brain. Got 1.5 million neurons in our gut. And we created it as the enteric brain, and it makes lots of the building blocks for the neurotransmitters for the brain. So it's really critical for them to eat well, for them to eat roughage, and for them to have crunchy food, and for them to try and minimize the sort of fat, salt, sugar layer that sits across the top, so that you're feeding the whole microbiome instead of fat. That's not a really good lunch at all. So microbiome is pretty important. So we're getting into the screens and stuff. Screen time's had a lot of study now. So one of the interesting things in young children is that what's now surfacing is that 80% of the problem around screen time for kids is actually adult addiction. And so they give the child a screen so that they can, do something and keep the child quiet. But if we go on a little bit from age, or even in the first 3 years, one of the things that happens right up to school is we're building what's called a physics engine in our head. So when we move things around, create things in 3D, stack things up, we're building quite a real-time mathematics calibrator in our brain. So if I don't know, if a pen falls off a table, then I can hopefully catch it, and my child will get better and better at being able to catch that. AI can't catch it because it's a difficult process. It's a difficult calculation to make. So what we're now getting is some kids that by the time they get to school, they can't build blocks properly because they don't have that 3D spatial deference capability. And that is quite, because it's not built at the time it should be built, it takes longer then for them to be able to do that properly. And it also has impacts on various types of judgments around speed and physics and dexterity, small motor system, sports, and some findings are even around mathematics and those sorts of things. So it's a really interesting problem of not having kids do things in sort of real, physical with activities in terms of painting and building and those sorts of things. We've talked about the unstructured time. Another interesting trend is around the social rules. So we'll talk about that more at another time, but just as an example, I work in different countries, and one of the countries is the US. And when I was there the last time, where I was looking at restaurants that if you have, say, 3 kids, they'll have three iPads, those sorts of things. So it's really having to think about what we do in the kinds of ways that you want children to interact with you. So if we just take an example of a children's meal, if they're not interacting, if they're actually interacting with their screens, and if their adults are doing that as well, because that's very often the issue, then they're not learning direct interaction. They're not learning the patience of kind of waiting and eating with other people and doing those sorts of things. They're not actually learning how to not be bored, because there's lots of other things that they're just distracting themselves with. And I guess they're also not learning that it's not kind of all about them, because they're in this world again of being distracted by something instead of interacting. I'm heartened when I see situations where the phones aren't allowed to be in interaction, and definitely at home that would be one of the things that we can talk about later, that it's really important. So another aspect, I guess maybe I think the last thing that we'll have as a formal slide is about the phone. So lots of discussion on, in the 4 to 8 year old age group, when do we start to think about having the phone? So apart from the things as an adult that we have to think about, does a child need it? When do they need it? Why do they need it? You've got cost, and you've got what do I have to think about in terms of what the child is going to be exposed to. I'm always surprised by people who say, but what if I have to get hold of someone? And we seem to have forgotten the fact that there's dumb phones, there's phones that don't have to go online. So there's all sorts of really interesting phones now that do that. And this is an example of a phone that doesn't just let you text and make phone calls. It will actually allow you to take a picture and send it to your parents, and even to have a voice call, a group voice discussion, video call in your family. But it doesn't allow you to use data and go online. So and you also know where the child is. So there's all sorts of things to think about. So some of them that the recent data has come up around is there's, I guess, a bunch of behavioural problems that start to occur with phones, and it's because of some of the other things we'll talk about. Kids can get more tired. They also get more distracted. There's addiction issues around that. They get less sleep. So there's quite an average drop as soon as you have children with phones that are actually connected to the internet, because again they're attracted to them. And they really like using them. One of the interesting discussions is around the creativity. Because you get less of that abstractive activity, and because they are more cognitively tired when they're interacting with screens, that creative aspect is part of what disappears. But there's also different reasons why the creativity happens. So I was thinking about today when I was looking at it, and one of the things that happens is the motor and optical developments, because it slows down, it also has impacts around how they think about even engaging in activities such as games. They learn different ways to be able to do it. And because they, at the same time, get a lot of information overload because things are fast and they're glitzy, their brain learns to kind of hop around and get easily distracted and look for the next sparkly thing within seconds. So it's an interesting sort of problem that we've got. It changes the brain in various ways. So if we go on with that point, neurons will reset in as little as 6 seconds anyway when they pick up data. But if you, what you're doing, so a screen is built with peripheral vision activity. And one of the things that the brain does is it has to pay attention to that peripheral vision. It's just how we're wired. So it's why all of the little reminders and flashes are in the corners of a screen. So one of the, because it's an electrical excitatory situation and kids are so already, you know, so much is happening in their brains. It's something which is very easy to tune into and get them to be a lot more easily distracted and hop around more easily. And the way that things like search engines are built, they're also built for adults as well to get quickly distracted and connected off onto hyperlinks and those sorts of things. Some studies around hyperlinks are that even if you're going down a hyperlink for information, every time you go down another hyperlink, you lose as much as 25 to 30% of the recall of the information. So it's quite an interesting whole area. So again, attention span. And there's some other kind of impedance to learning in terms of, I think attention span has halved in the last 15 years, and that's across everyone. It's not children, it's everyone. So you have a number of things which I'll go into next week and dive into that sort of thing about, you know, how can we do that to do with a learning situation. One of the things to really think about is it alters your relationship with them. So the amount of parents that I've had that have said, I just wish that I'd waited. And even things we've been talking about are really important, but the things that they talked about more where their own relationship suddenly shifts, because now it's about rules and it's about what you can't have, and it's about you know, the altercations around the use of something which is hugely sticky and built to be, and if you're also tussling with how much you use your tech, then you've got guilt about, do we just both sort of, you know, disconnect and look at that too much? And so there's all sorts of things that alter. And so you have to really think about when you want that to happen, when you want it to start. And another thing is the child learns to be less reflective very often in pausing and thinking about how to even have discussions on this, because suddenly they're used to a medium which is very fast, you know, whether they're texting and whether they're answering things or whether they're stimulated to be very quick and not necessarily to stop and think, well, how might someone feel if I say, well, I don't like you either, or and that leaks back into the relationship with the parents. They say they notice that difference in how they then interact with their children. And so some of it is to do with the addiction and distraction habits as well. There's a number of discussions that we can have, I think it's in week 3 that we'll talk about, to do with the long-term physical connections around if you don't manage the tech well. It can actually be very good or not, depending on how it's used. It certainly turns them into a commodity, was another comment. There's an Australian writer that did a large study on kids, and she had daughters, so she was looking at some of the differences in things like the pictures that were being sent once kids went online. And so what you got, because even if you've got a dumb phone, you can still usually take a picture of yourself and you can show friends. And what she noticed was that her 7 and 8-year-old suddenly were taking the pictures, which were much more the posy pictures and this, you know, and then they went into the different ways of dressing, and suddenly the hair was done, and that was 8 years old. So she found that really fascinating, and they were looking at long-term studies of that. And I guess the last thing, if I'm flippant and someone says, when should I actually give a child a phone that it can go on and use data? I guess I'll say, well, when do you want them to see the first negative images that you would not like them to see, and without you? So yes, there's pornography, but there's also cyberbullying. There's interactions that you can't manage to have a look at whether or not you think that people are doing it properly. So also they're going to suddenly be forced into making some difficult ethical decisions about, do I weigh into that? Do I look at this? Do I send it on? Do I get annoyed if someone's sent it to me? So you've given them dilemmas that they are not yet ready to deal with emotionally and at a maturity level. So there's a lot of issues around that, and we can talk through, probably for the next couple of weeks, we'll be talking through them. And we'll also, of course, be talking about what you can do very well with tech and how you can manage that. But certainly in the 48-year age group, there's wonderful technologies that don't put the kids into situations where they're using open data. And there's also ways to get those kids pushed with to use technology to actually help them to exercise more and to interact more with other people. But you've got to think carefully about that and plan it, because naturally that's not what these things are designed to do. And that was just the lookup connection, and I think you've already got that.
Yeah.
So shall I put this off and we can have a chat?
Sure. Wow. What an interesting, I mean, it almost feels like you could be speaking to any adult as well, to be honest, with all that.
Absolutely, yes.
I could just relate to so much of what you said, whether it was me or whether it was my daughter. You're talking about exercising, you're talking about daydreaming. It's like what we spoke. If you cannot switch off fully, you cannot switch on fully. And you'll always be in that like half-ass mode and not being able to complete a piece of work. And that's something very interesting that I am seeing, with so on the project I get to meet with and have volunteers at different age groups. And I find it really fascinating how the younger generation, they cannot take stuff to completion. And I don't know if that's got to do with technology or not, but that's one thing which I have noticed, which is happening around. But I made a lot
It's
of
part
notes.
of it.
Yeah, and I made a lot of notes on a few different things, but um, like you spoke about daydreaming and abstraction and napping, and I know it because when I put myself into a habit of napping after lunch about 1:30 or so for 20-30 minutes, the kind of I think I would have the most incredible dreams in just like 15 minutes. And it almost feels like I've had 5 dreams at that same time in such a short space of time. It was just fascinating. So I'll start off with a question, then we can open it up for the others as well. My question is that some of us as parents, like I'm speaking from my own experience, a lot of this is about connection. At the end of the day, actually, if you think about it, it is all about love. It's all about answering one question: do you love me? And that's all we're doing. When we are not distracted, when we are with somebody else, you're looking at the person, you're holding their hand. At the end of the day, that really is what makes the world go round. You can say whatever you want to say about it, but all these things are just taking away from us telling the people how much we care about them or how much we love them, right? Fundamentally, that's what we're doing over here. So in a
Yeah,
situation where,
and one of the fascinating things about that is that it's physiological. It's the more we learn about direct neural connection and physiological oscillation, it's called, the more we realize we synchronize as well when we pay attention. So we can, you know, be pretending, but our brains actually stop doing it, and we can't fake that.
That's right. Yeah, and it's also like, the experiment you spoke about, where you had asked people to sit in front of each other and interact with each other face to face and be actually very actively interested and not. It makes a big difference. Even when you're having a Zoom call, for example, you just know it if somebody has got another screen open. And even if the
Yes.
eye goes to the other screen, you say, "What the bloody hell are you doing? Let's stop it." But the question which I wanted to ask you is that many of the parents travel. Okay, now my situation is not normal. I have, for whatever reasons, I've been away from Ela for long periods of time. But how do parents who are away, who are traveling, who are overseas, still maintain a good connection with the kids who are still growing up, who still need to know that daddy and mommy love them? Like you mentioned over here, especially at the ages of 7 and 8, they're forming their self-worth, etc. And that's a question which I constantly ask myself: is that, okay, what will Ela be thinking about me not being there with her, that she would see around other fathers being there? So what would you say to that, in terms of, if you are in circumstances which keep you away from the child for an extended period of time, but you're on a project or visa or whatever it is, how do you how do you connect with a child, and how do you know that daddy or mommy still loves me, although they're not there with me then and there?
Yeah. So it starts from the relationship that you have with them in the first place and how much attention you do pay when you are together. So I guess we all know, and we might have had really good experiences, really bad experiences with our own parents. I see a range now of capability for the parents to be able to maintain attention interacting with young children, which is worrying. But generally, you would adore them and you spend the time with them. If you've already got then that connection, then if you're having to travel for, say, a project, then it's not the same as direct neural synchronization because you're not in the same space. But it's still, as long as you're taking the time, that they're important enough that you're connecting over screens and you're connecting or by phone. Some people actually like it by phone better because it feels more sort of direct and intimate, and the brain is less tired, and when you're having to try and take in screens as well. But usually if it's just the two of you,
Yeah.
then it's quite easy over a screen as well.
Yeah.
Multiple people get more difficult, and so that can top up. It's a fantastic thing. I use it all the time because I travel a lot, and I've got kids, even though mine have grown up, they still like to connect over a screen.
Yeah.
There's nothing that's going to get around direct connection as often as you can.
Yeah.
But if when you connect, you don't connect, if you come back and you're still constantly distracted, then it doesn't matter how often you come back and interact. They're not going to feel that they're connected with you and that you really are very interested in them. Whereas if when you're there, you're really there, then that is going to create a lot of kind of, money in the bank, if you like, that you'll then be taking out each time you're away and you have to interact with them. You've still got a store there that you can depend on.
Wow.
So it is one of the really important reasons why when you're at home, and we could talk about the adults, we could talk about your hypervigilance, we could talk about what it's doing to adult brains not to put your phones off when you go home, to still be on 24/7, to still look at the messages and the emails, to have it by your bed. The level of, again, distraction, disconnection, the changes in empathic pathways and executive pathways, it has all sorts of deleterious effects for us when we just let it bleed into that environment, which is our home environment, where we shouldn't let it, take over and I guess derail that connecting of people. So you have the rules when you can around, say when you eat, you don't have your phones at the table. You don't have your phones in a living room situation. If you want to watch a movie together, you don't have. So you have those ways of managing the technology so that when you are connecting, you're really connecting. Then when you have to use screens, at least it's there's a firm base, if you like. But you can do other things. So one of the things that someone I know at the moment does, because I think we're all a bit fed up of the Zoom calls and the Zoom drinks and the Zoom, he's a writer, director, and a beautiful writer. And he's taken to, with the lucky few of us, he will write letters. And they're absolutely beautiful stories, and he'll post them. And all of us that get them love it, because it's quite different to a quick Zoom call. It's not, it's the effort that he's used, but it's also quite a different medium. And when you're reading a story off that page that someone's written for you and sent to you, you've got all that love happening, but you also allow your brain to go off and make the mental pictures, which is why we love radio and we love stories and we love books so much, because we allow a massive amount of play in our brain. So yeah, there's a number of things to do that can keep you connected. It's about taking the time and making the effort to show someone you're thinking about them and you're paying attention to them and you care about them.
Yeah, because I think what I do is I do a bunch of these things myself. Every Sunday I write Ela a letter, and I do artwork in it. So that's a habit which I've cultivated, and I've put in the post. Some of them have reached an out, they haven't because of COVID. But I mean, when I've been away from her, a lot of artwork is what I've done, written books, illustrated books, and different forms of ways. So anyway, so it makes me feel a little better. Okay, why don't we ask, any other questions that you have for Dr. Fiona? Go ahead, Joanna.
Okay.
Joanna?
Hi, nice to meet you, Dr. Fiona, and thank you again so much for this.
You speak up a little bit. We can't hear you. Cannot hear you clearly.
You can't hear me? Maybe I should. This move the headphones.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
That's better. Okay. Well, I was saying thank you so much, Dr. Kerr, for the mini lecture. It was really fascinating. Really. My question doesn't come from a parent point of view. It comes from an educator point of view, or even a friend point of view. So even being friends with children. But it comes from the it's about the online learning in these times that we are living now, that lots of children are being forced in a way to engage with online learning. So it's not like something that the parents chose for them to have, but at the same time it's the reality of a lot of children that parents move around and they have to do international schooling. So right now it's the reality for a lot of children given the circumstances, but it's still the reality for other children even in more normal circumstances. And my question to you is that, what are your thoughts about it for educators who have to teach online? Because I found it very, very, very hard, especially with small children, to keep them interested. In this case, we are actually sharing an activity. So they are supposed to be doing something, but you cannot stop them from doing it wrong. You cannot really interact with them. So it's sometimes not that different from them watching like a YouTube video where they cannot interact. They're just taking the knowledge, which is good sometimes. I think some people learn better like this, but it's a real challenge for educators and friends, because sometimes I do that for friends' children. So yeah, that's my.
And you're absolutely right. It is a real challenge. I think week 3 as well. I've got some particular things around what works really well in that environment. And one of the things to think about then is what works well over a screen compared to what works much better in interaction. So the things that work better over a screen are the things that take effortful learning. So that's the rote learning type of things, because we've got different types of memory. So we've got many different types of memory, but an easy way to think about it is you've got effortful memory, which is the, I've got to do my times tables. And in fact, we now know that that's a really good way of putting that kind of information into your brain, because it just creates a chunk, which automatically then can be, pulled back up. But then you've got automatic memory, and that's much more based on emotion and creativity, imagination. So that is sparked by the things we were talking about earlier. That's much more apt to be sparked by direct interaction. So people that have to do remote learning normally, so when I talk to, say, remote learning country parents, the thing that is a really interesting, consistent theme is that they'll have the kids at the table, and it tends to be the mum, but the mum is still there as the translator. So you can be saying, do this or think about that or build it that way, and you've still got someone there who's a real person who is then doing it with them. And so that cognitive, physical learning is still aided. And so it is an interesting process. It's one of those things where we just can't replace the real, direct interaction. Once the child knows how to do something and it's lodged in their memory, then you can do an awful lot over the screen, because they've got those base pieces of knowledge that they can build on. But to actually create them, that's a lot harder over a distance process, especially if it's not the effortful memory that they can just, practice something, a specific task that's easy to delineate and codify, and that they can put that in over time. So it's that really difficult mixture that you're faced with when you can't do both. And so what some places are doing, so I've got friends in Finland, and they have resources where they're putting a lot of resource into mixing those two things, so that you get activities and you also get interaction. And they've got time off as well for parents who can do that with them. So they're kind of, they're using that multimodal effect, if you like, to get the information in. So it's a good question. And you are right. It is quite difficult in some of those aspects.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Joanna. Saul, with us, do you have any questions for Dr. Cook?
Hello, nice to meet you. Thank you for this seminar. I don't know if it's a good question, but I speak Spanish, and I just moved here to UK just a month ago, and I work with children, and this thing I don't know how to make them feel understood, even if I don't understand very well what they are talking about. Like when they tell me their things, I want to really understand, but there are some words or some things that I cannot get at all, but I want they feel like I'm there for them. And I don't know how to make that work.
Some of that goes back to some of the earlier discussion we had, which was if you were here at that time, that exercise where you were listening to someone and making them feel heard. And what was really interesting even there was it was much more important to be present with the person and paying attention to them. That's what counted almost more than what they were telling you. And so what becomes really interesting is they're picking up all of those chemicals that you're actually giving them, and all of those electrical synchronizations that you're creating. So even if you can't understand all the words, they are picking up a lot of data from you that says that you are present and that you are attending and that you care about what they're saying. So we're really interesting in that we have many other ways apart from the words, in which we communicate, and sometimes words actually get in the way. And I've seen situations working in countries where people don't speak English, where they were almost much better in the specific communication when they stopped trying to actually use language. And it's just an interesting process with us that We pick up whether someone's telling the truth. We pick up whether someone cares and is interested. And that's got nothing to do with the language, the actual language. So, yeah, it's so as long as that's what you're doing, then don't worry, they'll be picking that up.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Presence and what's in your heart, really. If you genuinely love them, then that connection just goes through in your demeanor, in the body language, in the tone, in how you will touch them and how you interact with them. I think that's what you're saying, Dr. Kerr. And also, I think, when you look at language and communication, they say that about 7% of the impact is words, and there is 37% is tone, and the rest 55% is really body language, which makes the complete communication. I think we just
and now we know that the actual chemical stuff too. Yeah. And I thought you might have been going towards speaking more than one language as well. And that's always a wonderful thing to do with children. And the more you can expose them to different languages, the better. And again, what's fascinating is it's not just that they're learning, that their brain creates multi-base patterns for the words. It's also that when you speak a different language, if you speak it well, one of the reasons why we're much faster at picking a language up when we actually go and live in that country is not just that you're hearing it all the time, you're actually exposed to their food, to their way of life, to their smells, to their morals, and those things all shape how your brain codes language. It's really fascinating. It's much deeper than we think. And so you become more tolerant as well when you're multilingual. You become brighter too. So for anyone who speaks more than one language, you're cleverer.
Great. I think we are slightly over time. Why don't we just have one last question and then we can wrap this session up. There'll be a recording as well. I'll find a way to put it across to you guys. I need to figure that out yet. But Vikas, do you have any question?
Thanks to Dr. Kerr. It was quite nice to hear some of the aspects which we don't see in normal reading and other ways. So my gratitude and thanks for it. I do not have any particular question. However, like one of the challenges is it's good to understand the technical understanding of how does things are happening. I think for me it will help if we understand how do you transform the behavior if you see any of the signs within the kids and you would like it to turn into a positive outcome. Are there any techniques around it?
Anything specific you want to share with us?
So like say for one of the examples are like I find my son to be quite distracted when he's eating his food. So somehow he's 8-year-old, somehow he's not, somewhere we lagged bringing him to be foodie. Me and my wife both are foodie, but he seems to be not of a great interest in food. He's only particular type of things he likes. So whenever he is kind of on a dining table, he's quite distracted. So if you need to change or transform this behavior, what kind of techniques can be used?
So, boy, there's a bunch of questions. Do you have a big family? Or is there just him, or are there siblings?
No, so he has got a younger brother who is 2 or 3 year old. So they're quite well bonded, and we have 4 of us, 2 of us and the 2 kids.
Okay, and are you not looking at sort of televisions or screens when you're eating?
So not television in particular, but yes, and the screen is one of the problems. Yeah, iPad.
Yep. Okay, so that goes. There's no way around that. So you don't have screens at the table. They don't have screens at the table. It's pretty.
So as a parents, we don't use the screens while we are eating. It's just the kids, and also he's not allowed all the time to have his screens. There are times where we have particularly stopped using a screen for them as well. But what happens is when you're not providing the screen itself, still he's not engaged, if you like, on the food
he won't
itself.
Starve, I guess is a basis. So we had a rule right from when, if I talk for myself, apart from helping other people, you could still have screens, and you could still have books and those sorts of things when my kids were growing up, and probably my husband also would have used them if he'd been allowed to. But we just had an absolute rule that what they did was they learnt that family time meals, that we always had dinner together, and that was the time where you came together and you shared food and you shared ideas. And there were months, depending on what their ages were, where they either wouldn't interact very much or they wouldn't eat very much, but they will never starve, and they eventually do start to interact. We also got them involved in cooking, so right from 8, actually, they started, and by 10, my kids, and I've got boys, they had to cook a meal a week. The family meal, and I would assist them, and they both cook really well now. But part of that was also getting them interested in what was actually happening. As you said, you're foodies, and so suddenly they started thinking about smells and taste and putting things together, and we had really basic meals, and it got better and better as they got more imaginative and they started taking pleasure in actually cooking. But the big thing is, if you're inconsistent, and sometimes they'll have a screen and sometimes they won't, because screens are so very sticky. As soon as someone's had a screen at the table, their brain will say next time, that's what I want. And there's just got to be basically a hard and fast rule that's it. When you sit to eat, you sit to eat and talk. And if they don't want to talk, that's their choice. Eventually they'll talk. And if they don't want to eat, eventually they'll eat. You've got to shape what you want the behavior in that house to be. And if what you want in the mealtime is interaction with your children, then you'll get that. That just might take a little while.
Yeah.
Thanks. That's very, very encouraging. I think probably I'll try to implement these techniques.
So this is something really interesting, okay, Dr. Kaur. So whenever I'm with Ela and we are there, so we have times where, okay, there's no screen time. So she'll come and she'll say, I want to see whatever, cartoon, etc. Cartoon, daddy. So I said, no, yeah, this time, next 3 hours, you just got me. We got to do whatever we got to do. And then she'll start crying. I said, okay, let's cry together. We don't have a screen right now. And then after a while, she'll get quiet. But anyway, listen, this has been just a fascinating conversation. I think the conversation can go much longer. There's just so much to talk about. But I really would like to take the time to thank you once again, Dr. Kaur, for preparing for this. I know you've got multiple priorities and different engagements, but you've taken the time out. And I'm really curious to find out as to what happened to the others, which I'll do at my end. But, I wonder if did I put the time zone incorrectly or something. I'll have to go and check. But I'll do that at my end. And we'll have the next session the same day in the month of June. And then one topic. So,
yes, but we had a lovely discussion with the people that were here. It was really nice to talk to you.
Fantastic. And I will make this recording available for those who could not come and, do whatever follow-up work we need to do over here. And thank you, Vikas, Saul, and Joanna for joining us and the interaction. So,
thanks for the opportunity, Puneet, and to Dr. Kaur as well. And please share the recordings. So I would like